The moment Adeline Rosenfeld stood up, in the middle of the Vienna council chamber, and quoted ancient vampire law back to its own sovereign, every immortal in the room stopped breathing. She had not meant to cause a catastrophe. She had come to this hidden chamber beneath the city's oldest opera house as a translator, a neutral human scholar brought in to verify the authenticity of a decree written in archaic Wallachian script that even most vampires could no longer read. She had not come to challenge anyone. She had certainly not come to lock eyes with the white-haired prince who sat at the head of the Heliobsian table, like something carved from winter itself, his silver gaze flickering between disbelief and something raw and dangerous that she could not quite name. But there it was. She had quoted Decree 7 of the Blood Covenant of 1423, word for word, in the original script, and the entire chamber had gone silent. "You will find," she said, keeping her voice steady, despite the fact that her heart was hammering so loudly. She was certain every vampire in the room could hear it. That Article 12 of that same decree explicitly prohibits the forced surrender of a human life to satisfy a political debt. Those are the exact words. I have the original document in front of me. The vampire at the far end of the table, a sleek and ancient creature named Drevoskan, who wore his authority like a second skin, leaned forward with a smile that was nothing but teeth. The little human quotes dead law. How charming, and entirely irrelevant. That decree was penned by a prince who no longer sits on any throne. The room shifted. Adeline felt it before she saw it. A change in pressure, a shift in the temperature of the air. A silence so complete that even the candle flames along the chamber walls seemed to hold still. Vladislav Belisar had risen from his chair. He was the kind of being that redefined the word presence. 6 feet and several additional centuries of command made him something that simply occupied space differently than anything else alive or otherwise. His hair was white as snow against his pale skin, swept back from a face that was angular and sharp and unnervingly beautiful. The kind of face that artists had once wept trying to recreate and failed every time. His eyes were a silver, so pale, they looked like the moon had decided to look back at you. He wore a black coat with silver thread detailing that cost more than most people's apartments, and when he moved, it was with the absolute certainty of a man who had not been told no in a very, very long time. And he was staring at Adeline with an expression she could not categorize. "That decree," Vladislav said, his voice a low, precise instrument that somehow filled the entire vaulted chamber without effort, was penned by me. The silence that followed was so complete that Adeline could hear her own exhale. Drevoskan's smile flickered. Just slightly. Just enough for Adeline to see it. "Prince Vladislav," he said smoothly, recovering, "your decree was written 6 centuries ago. Circumstances change. The council has already voted." "The council voted on a matter they believed had no legal obstacle," Vladislav said. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. Every word was a stone dropped from a great height. "It has a legal obstacle," she found it. His silver eyes moved back to Adeline. "Read it again." Adeline looked down at the parchment in her hands, the original cracked and darkened with age. The ink of 600 years somehow still crisp beneath the magnifying glass she had brought. She was a professor of medieval history and historical linguistics at the University of Vienna. She had spent her career around idle documents and old knowledge. She had never, not once, expected that career to place her in an underground chamber full of vampires, defending a stranger's life with a contract she had only been given 20 minutes to examine. But she had examined it, and she had found what she had found. And she was not the kind of woman who stayed quiet when staying quiet meant someone died. She read it again, clearly, in the original Wallachian and then again in precise modern German, because she was thorough and she was not going to give anyone a loophole through ambiguous translation. When she finished, Vladislav looked at Drevoskan with an expression that was not quite a smile but contained the same quiet devastation as one. "The motion is invalid," he said. "The prisoner is released. I will hear no further argument on this matter tonight." Drevoskan's eyes went to Adeline, and for just a moment the mask came off entirely, and what was underneath was ancient and cold and absolutely furious. Then he stood, adjusted his cuffs, and walked out of the chamber without another word. His allies followed him one by one until the room held only Vladislav, 2 of his personal guards standing at the walls, and Adeline, who was still holding the parchment and breathing very carefully. Vladislav looked at her for a long time. "You are either very brave," he said finally, "or you did not understand what you were doing." "I understood exactly what I was doing," Adeline said. "I was preventing an illegal execution." "In a vampire court," he said, "as a human, uninvited." "I was invited," she pointed out. "Your counsel sent for me. I have the letter." Something moved at the edge of his mouth, not quite a smile, not yet. But something adjacent to it, something that looked like it had not been there in a long time. "You were invited as a translator, not as a defense advocate." "There was no one else volunteering for the position," she said. He looked at her for another long moment, and then he said very quietly, "No, there was not. That was the beginning of it." But the beginning was not the most difficult part. The most difficult part came 3 weeks later, when Adeline discovered that Drevoskan had placed her name on a blood list. She did not find out from Vladislav. She found out from one of her graduate students, a pale and nervous young man named Ferenc, who had arrived at her office door at 7 in the morning, looking like he had not slept since the council meeting, which he probably had not, because Ferenc was one of the few humans who operated in the peripheral circles of Vienna's vampire underground, and he knew what a blood list meant. "You have to leave the city," he said. "I have lectures this week," Adeline said. "Adeline, a blood list. You know what that means?" "It means Drevoskan is angry. He was angry in that chamber. He was angry when he left. I did not expect him to become less angry." She set down her coffee and looked at Ferenc with calm, measured attention. "What I would like to know is who told you, and what exactly they said." Ferenc produced his phone, turned it toward her, and showed her a photograph of a document that looked entirely too much like the one she had held in the council chamber. This one was newer. The ink was darker. Her name was at the top of it in a script she recognized as the formal notice used for enforceable vampire law. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "How long do I have?" "Drevoskan does not usually wait more than a week," Ferenc said miserably. Adeline picked up her coffee again. "Then I need to make a phone call." She did not have Vladislav's personal number. She had never expected to need it. What she had was the contact information for the council's administrative secretary, a vampire named Solvane, who had treated her with professional courtesy during the translation contract, and who Adeline judged, correctly, to be someone who valued institutional procedure over personal loyalty to any particular faction. She called Solvane and explained the situation in clear academic language, the way she presented papers at conferences, organized and supported with evidence and devoid of unnecessary emotion. When she finished, there was a pause, and then Solvane said, "I will convey your situation to the prince." "Thank you," Adeline said. She taught her morning lecture on the political architecture of 14th century Eastern European courts. She taught it well. 32 students took notes, and 3 of them asked excellent questions. She answered each one. She did not look at her phone during class, because she believed in presence and attention in the classroom. She looked at her phone afterward. There was a single message from a number she did not recognize. It contained an address and a time. 9 o'clock this evening. Nothing else. She went. The address was a building she had passed 100 times on the edge of the First District, an old Baroque structure with a facade so ornate it faded into the general architectural extravagance of Vienna without standing out at all. There was a door at the side, narrow and unlabeled, and when she knocked, it opened immediately to reveal one of the guards she recognized from the council chamber. He was enormous and white-haired, and looked at her with the professional blankness of someone paid to ensure no expression crossed their face under any circumstances. He led her upstairs, through a series of rooms that were as far from a council chamber as possible. Books everywhere, not decorative books arranged to suggest cultivation, but actual books, read books. Books with worn spines and marked pages and notes visible in the margins of those that lay open. There were maps on the walls, old ones, some of them so old they showed coastlines that no longer existed. There was a fireplace with an actual fire in it, which surprised her, and beside the fireplace were 2 chairs, and in one of them sat Vladislav Belisar in a considerably less formal coat than the one from the council chamber. Though formal by any standard she had ever applied, he stood when she came in. She noticed that, old courtesy, centuries old, automatic. "Sit," he said, "please." She sat. He sat. The fire made small sounds between them. Drevoskan has placed your name on a blood list, he said. I know, she said. That is why I am here. I discovered it this afternoon, he said, and something in his voice went very still and very controlled, in a way that told her the stillness was doing a great deal of work. He moved faster than I anticipated. He knew I would intervene if I had warning. You were not going to intervene? I am intervening now, he said. I had him before the inner council said this evening. The blood list has been formally invalidated. He paused. It took somewhat more persuasion than the decree last month. Adeline considered that. Drevoskan is a problem that keeps reasserting itself, she said. Drevoskan, Vladislav said, has been a problem for approximately 200 years. He and I have a complicated history that is not relevant to your immediate situation. What is relevant is that while I have removed the formal blood list, I cannot guarantee his informal intentions. He looked at her steadily. He does not forgive easily. Humans who make him look foolish in public do not typically live long enough to observe how long his memory is. That is a very elegant way of saying I am still in danger, Adeline said. Yes, he said, it is. She held his gaze. His eyes in the firelight were less silver and more the color of smoke, and they were watching her with an attention that was uncomfortably complete. What do you suggest? She asked. My protection, he said, formally extended. I will attach my housemark to your name in the public record. It will signal to every vampire in this city and every other city with a council that you are under the authority of House Belisar, and that any harm done to you is a direct challenge to me personally. Adeline was quiet for a moment. That is a significant thing to offer a stranger. You are not precisely a stranger, he said. You quoted my own decree back to me in a chamber full of my enemies and saved a life in the process. That is not the behavior of a stranger. That is the behavior of someone who operates on principle rather than self-interest. I had self-interest, she said honestly. If I had stayed quiet and something had happened to that prisoner, I would not have been able to function afterward. Staying quiet would have cost me too. Something shifted in his expression. Something genuine and unguarded that he almost immediately contained, but not quite fast enough. What do you know about House Belisar? He asked. What I have read, she said, which is more than most people and less than you. Tell me what you have read. House Belisar is one of the oldest vampire houses on the continent. It predates the current council structure by several centuries. Its founding prince established the Blood Covenant of 1423, which, as I have reason to know, contains considerably more nuanced legal protections than most people currently enforce. The house has been largely absent from active politics for the last 50 to 80 years, which most factions have interpreted as either decline or disinterest. She paused. I suspect it is neither. He was watching her with that same expression again, the one she could not quite categorize. It is neither, he confirmed. Then what is it? She asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then he said, I was tired. It is a strange thing to say. Vampires do not tire the way humans do. But there is a kind of exhaustion that comes from centuries of the same arguments, the same betrayals, the same political games dressed in new clothing. I withdrew. I maintained my house. I maintained my obligations. But I stopped attending, and eventually the world seemed content to proceed without me, and I let it. He looked at the fire. I convinced myself that my absence had made me irrelevant, that what I had built had been superseded or forgotten. And then someone quoted your decree, Adeline said softly. And then someone quoted my decree, he agreed. The fire snapped between them. Outside, Vienna hummed with its nighttime self, trams and late restaurants and the particular music of a city that has always known how to be beautiful under darkness. I will accept your protection, Adeline said, under conditions. His eyebrow moved, just slightly, as though the concept of conditions was mildly unexpected. Name them. I continue my work. I do not relocate. I do not abandon my students. And I do not disappear into whatever protection detail you have in mind, in a way that makes it impossible for me to function. I have responsibilities and I intend to honor them. Those are reasonable conditions, he said. And I want to understand what I am agreeing to, she said. The full implications of a housemark, what it means legally, politically, and practically. I will not sign something I have not read. His expression did what it had done at the edge of the council chamber. that almost smile again, more visible this time. "I expected nothing less," he said. He spent the next 2 hours explaining it to her. She asked precise, organized questions. He answered them without evasion or condescension, which she noted and appreciated. By midnight, they had moved from the formal chairs to a working arrangement over a low table covered in documents, her with a notepad, and 3 different reference texts she had pulled from his shelves, because they were immediately relevant and she assumed he would not mind, and him with the kind of patient, detailed attention to her questions that spoke of someone who was genuinely interested in being understood rather than simply agreed with. When she left at midnight, she had signed the formal agreement for house protection, and she had 4 pages of notes, and she had a sense, specific and surprising, that something significant had just begun. The housemark went into the public record the following morning. The effect was immediate and visible. Adeline noticed it first in the small ways. The graduate student who worked in the history department archive, and whom she had suspected of being something other than human, began treating her with a very particular deference. A set of tickets to an event she had expressed mild interest in appeared on her desk without explanation. A meeting with a visiting lecturer who had requested access to a restricted collection was suddenly rescheduled, delaying his visit, and when she looked into it, she found that the visiting lecturer had ties to Drevoskan's faction, and that Vladislav had apparently made a single phone call. She called him about the lecture. "I had that under control," she said. "I am aware," he said. "I made it easier. I would have preferred to handle it myself." "You would have spent 3 hours managing a situation that required 3 minutes on my end," he said. "Your time is valuable." She paused. "That is a surprisingly practical argument." "I am a surprisingly practical person," he said. She found herself smiling at the window of her office. She turned away from it in case anyone in the courtyard below could see her. They fell into a rhythm. He would appear at her office once or twice a week, sometimes with documents that required translation or historical verification, sometimes apparently without a specific purpose, which she noticed but did not comment on. She worked. He watched her work with the air of someone who found it genuinely interesting. Occasionally he would pick up a book from her shelves and read while she finished something, and there was a comfort to it that surprised her by developing faster than she expected comfort to develop with anyone, let alone with a 600-year-old vampire prince. He walked her home one evening in November, 3 weeks after the housemark agreement, because there had been a report of unusual vampire activity near her building, and he intended to verify there was no threat before leaving her to the night. She did not argue. She had argued about the lectures and the archive meeting and lost both in the sense that his interventions had been quietly effective, and she was developing a sense of which battles mattered and which ones were simply reflexive resistance to being cared for, which she recognized as a habit she had built over years of managing everything alone. The walk was 20 minutes. They talked about a document she had been working on, a medieval land treaty that contained, as she had discovered that afternoon, an embedded secondary clause written in a cipher she suspected was Wallachian in origin. It would have been standard practice for a house of that period, he said. Secondary clauses in cipher were used to protect provisions that could not be publicly acknowledged. "What kind of provisions?" she asked. "Alliances between vampire and human bloodlines that neither party could be seen to officially sanction," he said. There was a period in the 14th and 15th centuries when the political cost of open alliance was too high, but the strategic value was too great to abandon. So they hid it in the contracts. "You knew this was happening," she said. "At the time, I was one of the people doing it," he said simply. She looked at him. Walking beside her in the cold November air, he was somehow both completely belonging to Vienna's contemporary night, tall and elegant against the lit streets, and also entirely elsewhere, 6 centuries of context that she was only beginning to understand. "Tell me about that period," she said. He told her. She listened. By the time they reached her building, she had forgotten to keep track of how far they had walked. They stood at her door for another 20 minutes while she asked questions, and he answered them with the specific pleasure of someone who had not been asked in a very long time. "You should come in," she said eventually. I have coffee, and there is an 1897 study of Wallachian political structure in my study that I think you would find interesting for the wrong reasons. The wrong reasons, he repeated. Because I suspect it gets half of what you just told me completely backwards, and I think you would enjoy correcting it. He came in. He stayed until 3 in the morning. He corrected the 1897 study in detail and with what she could only describe as restrained glee. When he finally stood to leave, he paused in the doorway of her study and looked back at the room as though memorizing it. The books and papers, and the lamp she preferred because it was warm rather than bright, and her sitting in the middle of it with her notes and her coffee, and she saw the same unguarded expression from the fireplace evening cross his face again. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" she asked. "Someone who would use the housemark for immediate advantage and then maintain careful diplomatic distance," he said. "Most people who engage with vampire courts do so for what they can obtain. Scholarship, resources, access, protection for their careers. I am using the housemark for protection," she pointed out. "You are using it for protection, and you have not asked for a single additional thing," he said. "And you have spent 3 evenings teaching me about a period of history I lived through by asking questions that I had not asked myself." She looked at him across the room. "I enjoy talking with you," she said simply. "It is not a complicated motivation." He looked at her for a long time. "No," he said softly, "I do not suppose it is." He left. She sat with her notes and her cooling coffee and the specific warmth of the room, and acknowledged to herself that the feeling currently occupying her chest was not a professionally appropriate one, and that it had been building for several weeks, and that she was going to need to decide what to do about it. What she did about it was, she continued treating him exactly as she had been treating him, which is to say directly, honestly, and with genuine interest in what he was saying. She was not a woman given to strategy in personal matters. She found strategy in personal matters exhausting and beneath her. If something was worth having, it was worth the pursuing with the same clarity she brought to everything else. She did not know yet that he was doing precisely the same thing. The crisis came in December. It arrived in the form of a summons from the Inner Council, the most senior governing body of vampire authority in Central Europe, which operated from a chamber so far beneath the city that the stone walls had been there before the city existed above them. Vladislav received the summons on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, Adeline had received one too. She called him immediately. "Your Inner Council has summoned me," she said. "I know," he said. His voice was doing the controlled thing again, the one that meant he was managing something significant. "I received mine this morning. I believe they are connected." "Drevoskan," she said. "Drevoskan," he confirmed. "He has taken the matter of your house protection to the Inner Council. He is arguing that I exceeded my authority by extending house protection to a human outside the traditional protocols. He is also arguing that my long absence from active court participation has legally compromised my standing to issue such protection at all." Adeline sat down. She thought through this carefully. "Has it?" she asked. "Legally compromised your standing?" "There is an argument to be made," he said. "A prince who withdraws from court participation for more than 50 years under specific treaty structures can be considered to have informally abdicated certain rights. I was not present for the last formal renewal of house records. There is a gap. How big a gap?" 63 years, he said. "All right," she said. "When is the Inner Council hearing?" "Friday," he said. "Then I have 2 days to research Inner Council precedent," she said. "Do you have access to the complete record archive?" A pause. "Adeline, Vladislav, do you have access to the archive?" Another pause, longer, weighted with something she could not see but could feel in the quality of his silence. "You do not have to do this," he said. "The Inner Council is not the court of last Friday evening. It is older and more dangerous, and Drevoskan will not be caught off guard twice. Whatever he has planned for this hearing, he has planned it carefully." "I know," she said. "Archive access, please." He gave her the access. He also, she discovered when she arrived at the archive building that evening, was there himself, having apparently decided that if she was going to spend 2 days in the most sensitive legal archive in vampire history, he was going to be in it with her. She did not comment on this. She found a table, spread out her materials, and worked. He worked beside her. They passed documents back and forth. She read Wallachian script at a speed that made him stare the first time he saw it. She explained that she had spent 6 years specifically studying that script, and that speed was simply what 6 years looked like. He nodded and passed her another document. On the second evening, at 11:30, she found it. It was in the renewal records from 1891, a case very similar to the present one, a vampire house whose lord had been absent for 47 years, who had extended house protection to a human ally, which had been challenged by a rival. The Inner Council's ruling at that time had established a precedent that house protection rights could not be revoked on grounds of participation, absence, if the absent lord could demonstrate continuous maintenance of house obligations through alternate means. Vladislav, she said. He was beside her in a way that told her he had been watching her face for the past several minutes. What did you find? She showed him. He read it. His eyes moved over the text with the speed of someone who had known this script in its living form. When he finished, he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something open and surprised and moved. I maintained my house obligations through written correspondence and financial instrument for the full 63 years, he said. I have complete records, every obligation met, every treaty honored. Then you meet the 1891 precedent, she said. Yes, he said. Then we have our argument. Yes, he said again. He was still looking at her the same way. Adeline, yes. Why? He asked. You have protection through the housemark. Even if I lose standing at the Inner Council, the invalidation will be challenged further. You could argue for your own continuance through other means. Your knowledge of the law gives you leverage. You do not need to do this for me. She looked at him very directly. You wrote Decree 7 in 1423, she said. You put into law a protection for human lives that 600 years later still had force when no one else in that room thought to use it. You built something that lasted and that mattered, and then you stepped back and let yourself be forgotten. She held his gaze. I am not interested in letting that continue. He was very still. The archive was silent around them except for the sound of old buildings settling and the faint mechanical hum of the climate control system that kept the documents stable. You deserve better than being forgotten, she said. He reached across the table and touched her hand. Just his fingers over hers, a simple pressure, completely still. It was the first time he had touched her in any deliberate way, and the temperature of that contact, cool and precise and certain, went through her like a key finding a lock. I have not been forgotten, he said quietly. Not entirely, not since October. She looked at his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a long moment in the quiet of the archive, surrounded by 6 centuries of law and history and blood covenants. And neither of them said anything further because nothing further was needed just then. The Inner Council hearing on Friday was held in the chamber beneath the city that smelled of old stone and deep time. 14 vampires of extraordinary age and authority sat along a curved table of black marble. Dravoskan sat among them because he was, as Adeline had researched, technically a member of the Inner Council in a secondary capacity, which was a structural problem she had noted and flagged and been unable to resolve before the hearing. Vladislav entered the chamber first. He was dressed the way she had only seen him once before, the way he must have dressed when he had been regularly present at court, with the full insignia of House Belisar visible in the silver detailing of his coat and the signet ring on his right hand, and the particular quality of authority he wore like weather. He looked like what he was, which was ancient and sovereign, and entirely done with being underestimated. Adeline entered beside him. Dravoskan's expression when he saw them together was precisely the reaction she had expected, and she had used it as a design parameter. The hearing opened with Dravoskan's formal challenge, which he presented with polished precision. He argued the participation gap. He argued procedural irregularity. He argued that the extension of house protection to a human scholar with no prior vampire court standing was politically irresponsible and constituted an endorsement of human interference in vampire legal matters. He was eloquent. He had clearly prepared. When he finished, the chair of the Inner Council looked at Vladislav. House Belisar will respond. Vladislav presented the 1891 precedent. He presented the complete records of his obligation maintenance for 63 years, physical documents that his steward had delivered to the chamber that morning, bound and organized and indexed. He presented the original Decree 7. Article 12, the provision Adeline had found, and cited it directly in the context of the blood list Drevoskan had placed, and that had been formally invalidated, arguing that Drevoskan's challenge was itself legally motivated by the outcome of that invalidation, and therefore constituted a conflict of interest that should have disqualified him from the hearing. The chamber went very quiet at that last point. The chair of the inner council looked at Drevoskan, then at the document Vladislav had placed before her that detailed the conflict of interest argument in organized, precise, legally referenced language. Adeline had written that document. Vladislav had reviewed and approved every word. The chair said, "Council will recess to deliberate." They waited outside in a stone corridor that was lit by actual torches because the inner council chamber did not believe in electric light. Adeline stood with her back against the wall and breathed steadily. Vladislav stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the composed steadiness of him, the quality of someone who had waited out important decisions many times before and knew how to manage the time. "If they rule against us," she said. "Then we appeal to the High Charter," he said, "which takes 6 months and is unpleasant, but the precedent is on our side, and we would eventually prevail." "You have thought through the contingencies," she said. "I have been thinking through contingencies since October," he said. "You have been in my thoughts rather consistently since October." She looked up at him. The torchlight was doing something to the silver of his eyes, warming it toward gold. "Is that a formal declaration of something?" she asked. "It is an accurate statement of fact," he said. "What I make of it depends somewhat on your response to it." She considered him. This man who had built a law that protected human lives in 1423 and then stood behind it in 2024 when no one else thought to. Who had walked her home in November and stayed until 3 in the morning, arguing with a wrong book because she had wanted him to. Who had come to the archive without being asked because the idea of her in a dangerous place without him, there was apparently not something he was able to manage. "My response to it," she said, "is that you have been rather consistently in my thoughts since October as well." He looked at her for a long, specific moment. Then he lifted his hand and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. And it was such a small gesture, and it undid her completely. "When this is resolved," he said, "when this is resolved." She agreed. The council deliberated for 40 minutes. When they returned, the chair read the ruling in the formal script that Adeline had now learned to pass quickly. The 1891 precedent was upheld. House Belisar's standing was confirmed. The house protection extended to Adeline Rosenfeld was ruled valid, and Drevoskan's challenge was dismissed with a formal notation of conflict of interest that would remain in the permanent record. Drevoskan received this without visible reaction. He was a very controlled person. But when his eyes met Adeline's across the chamber as they were filing out, she saw the same cold ancient fury she had seen in the council meeting in October, and she understood with perfect clarity that this was not over, not truly, not while Drevoskan remained in his current position. She understood something else as well. She was no longer afraid of him in the way she had been. Not because the danger had diminished, but because she was no longer facing it alone. In the corridor outside, Vladislav placed his hand at the small of her back as they walked, and she did not move away from it. The resolution of the inner council hearing had consequences that played out over the following weeks, some expected and some not. The expected ones. Drevoskan's faction became more circumspect in their opposition, operating at a remove that was harder to challenge directly. The house protection remained intact. Adeline's life returned to something resembling normal, if normal could be said to include twice-weekly visits from a vampire prince and an increasingly intimate understanding of 6 centuries of political history. The unexpected ones. A letter arrived from an elderly vampire scholar named Tesavo, who had been one of Vladislav's contemporaries in the 15th century, and who had, it turned out, been following the proceedings of the last 3 months with considerable interest from his home in Prague. He wrote that it was very gratifying to see Prince Belisar returning to active engagement, and that the human scholar sounded remarkable, and that if either of them was ever in Prague, they should visit. You have a friend who has been watching the proceedings, Adeline said, setting the letter down. Tessiveau and I have known each other for 500 years, Vladislav said. He was present when I wrote the Blood Covenant. He helped draft Article 12. She looked at him. I should like to meet him, she said. He would like to meet you, Vladislav said. He called you remarkable. He said the human scholar sounded remarkable, she corrected. He has not met me. He has read the transcript of the October Council meeting, the Inner Council hearing, and apparently managed to obtain a copy of the conflict of interest document you drafted. Vladislav's voice held something that was definitively a smile now, no longer an almost. He said, and I quote, that she argues like a 15th century jurist. I will take that as a compliment, Adeline said.
He intended it as the highest possible one,
Vladislav said. She smiled. He watched her smile with the specific attention of someone who had decided it was one of their preferred things in the world and intended to go on paying attention to it. The second crisis came in January, and it came from a direction neither of them had fully anticipated. There was a faction within vampire court politics that Adeline had been aware of, but had perhaps underestimated. Not Drevoskan's faction, but an older one, operating under a banner called the Pure Line, which held that vampire-human relations of any form beyond strict transactional necessity were a corruption of vampire sovereignty. They were not large, but they were old and they were wealthy, and they had been watching the events of October through December with increasing alarm. The alarm was specifically about the nature of Adeline and Vladislav's relationship, which by January had become visible in the court record in ways that went beyond a protection agreement. He had attended a public lecture she gave at the university. She had been present at 2 formal court dinners at his residence in a capacity that was not simply guest. The archive evenings were known. Tessivau's letter had been discussed in certain circles. They came for her on a Wednesday, which was ordinary in its cruelty because ordinary days do not prepare you. She was walking from the university to the tram when 2 vampires she did not recognize fell into step beside her. They were not Drevoskan's people. She knew Drevoskan's people now by sight and manner. These were different, colder, more certain in the specific way of people who believe their cause justifies what they are about to do. Professor Rosenfeld, the one on her left, said, "You will come with us." "I will not," she said, and kept walking. She also, in the same motion, pressed the emergency contact on her phone that Vladislav had set up in November. It sent a location signal and a single coded message. He had explained to her at the time that he would respond within 8 minutes, regardless of where he was or what he was doing. She was counting on that. The vampire on her right moved to take her arm. She stepped sharply into his space rather than away from it, using the motion he expected from her to wrong-foot him, and brought her elbow back at an angle that she had practiced approximately 300 times in the self-defense course she had taken in November, immediately after the Bloodlist incident. Because she had decided that knowledge of law was an excellent first line of defense, and physical competence was an excellent second one. He was a vampire. It did not stop him, but it surprised him, which gave her 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough time for something to happen in the air above the street, a pressure change, a disturbance in the cold January dark, and then Vladislav was there. She had never seen him move at full speed before. Later she would try to describe it and find that language was an imprecise tool for the purpose. He was simply elsewhere, and then he was there, between her and the 2 vampires, and the transformation in him was complete and immediate. He was not the man from the archive evenings or the fireplace conversations. He was something older and much more dangerous, and every line of him communicated a threat so ancient and so certain that even vampire instinct apparently recognized it as absolute. He said, very quietly in the old script, something she did not fully understand because it was older Wallachian than she had studied. But the 2 vampires understood it. They went very still. Then one of them said, "Pure Line has declared that the human woman must be removed from." "I am aware of Pure Line's declaration," Vladislav said. His voice was so quiet it was nearly inaudible, and it carried farther than a shout. "I am also aware that they made that declaration without bringing it to the council, without a legal ruling, and without any authority whatsoever to act on it. What you are doing right now is not an ideological statement. It is a criminal act under Blood Law Chapter 9, Section 4. I will give you exactly one opportunity to leave. The two vampires looked at each other. Then they left. Vladislav turned to Adeline. His eyes ran over her the way they did when he was assessing, rather than simply looking, checking her for harm, with the systematic attention of someone who had already decided that any harm found would require a significant response. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. Her voice was steady. She was aware of her own heartbeat and the cold of the January street, and the fact that his hand was on her arm now, a light grip, present and grounding. "You were here in 4 minutes, 3, he said. "I was already in the 1st district. Because of me?" she asked. He held her gaze. "I had a sense," he said. Dravoskan has been quiet for too long, and the Pure Line had been meeting more frequently. I did not like the shape of it. "You have been watching out for me," she said. "I have been watching out for you since October," he said. And there was nothing careful about it now, nothing managed. He said it directly and completely, the way she said things when she had decided. There was no point in being indirect. The protection agreement was a legal structure. This is something different. She looked at him in the cold street with the city moving around them. "I know," she said. "I know what this is." He brought her to his residence. He built a fire. He made phone calls in rapid, precise Wallachian that she mostly understood. He arranged for Pure Line to receive a formal legal challenge before morning that would tie them in proceedings for months and establish a crystal clear precedent about extra-legal action against a person under house protection. He did all of this in about an hour while she sat with tea and her notes from that day's lecture. Because she had been at work when it happened, and work did not disappear because someone had attempted to abduct her. When he was done with the phone calls, he came and sat beside her, not across from her, as he usually did when they were working, but beside her, close enough that she was aware of the specific quality of him, the cool steadiness, the contained force of someone who had been very frightened in a very controlled way, and was now on the other side of it. She put down her notes and looked at him. "Vladislav," she said. "Yes, when this is resolved," you said. "In December, in the corridor." "Yes," he said again. His voice was very quiet. "I think it may never be fully resolved," she said honestly. "There will always be another faction, another challenge. Another political structure that objects to the fact that you wrote a decree protecting human lives and then chose to protect a specific one. I do not think there is a point in the future where all obstacles are removed and conditions are perfect." He looked at her. He was very still. "I am not interested in waiting for that point," she said. "I am interested in now, this here, you specifically." He reached over and took her hand the way he had in the archive. Except this time he brought it to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, slow and deliberate and certain. She felt it all the way through. "You are the most remarkable person I have encountered in 6 centuries, he said against her hand. "And I have encountered a great many people in 6 centuries. "I know," she said. "I have read about most of them." He laughed. She had heard him laugh a handful of times, and each time it surprised her a little, the genuineness of it, the way it changed his face into something younger and warmer. He looked at her, and the laughter faded into something that was not less warm, just more serious, more present. "I love you," he said, simply, the way she would have said it, if she had said it first. She felt the words land in her chest and settle there with the quality of something that had always been going to happen, that was always going to find its home there. "I love you," she said. "I have for some time. I was waiting to be sure you understood what I meant by it." "What do you mean by it?" he asked. "All of it," she said. "All 6 centuries of you. The man who wrote the decree, and the man who stepped back, and the man who came to a hearing on 3 minutes' notice, and the man who stays until 3 in the morning arguing with wrong books. I am not interested in an edited version." He looked at her for a long, long moment. Then he pulled her close, carefully and completely, and she went without hesitation. And the warmth of the fire and the old books, and the sense of something enormous settling into rightness, was so complete that she simply stayed there for a while without needing anything else to be different. The months that followed were not without difficulty. They never would be entirely. Dravoskan remained a procedural opponent, finding creative ways to challenge Vladislav's court positions without directly crossing legal lines. Pure Line was tied in proceedings through spring, and when those proceedings had concluded, the ruling was so thorough that 3 of their senior members resigned from active court life. Tesevo came from Prague in February and spent a week at the residence, arguing happily with Adeline about 15th century legal theory and pronouncing her, at the end of the week, significantly better than remarkable. Adeline's department head asked her in March whether the rumors about her involvement with Vienna's vampire court were true. She said yes. He blinked. She explained the situation with the precision and organized calm she brought to all complex subjects. He blinked again, then said, "Well, I suppose that explains the visitor parking situation." There had been an incident in November when Vladislav had arrived in a car that his driver had parked in a manner that technically violated 3 municipal regulations, and somehow the parking attendant had simply never come by to ticket it. She told Vladislav this. He was unrepentant. The formal court acknowledgement of their relationship came in April, when Vladislav presented her, at the full spring sitting of the Vienna Council, not as a protected human or a contracted scholar, but as his chosen companion under the formal language of House Belisar's oldest traditions, which meant, as Adeline had researched and confirmed before agreeing to the presentation, that she was afforded every legal protection and social standing of a house member in her own right, without any change to her human identity or status. Dravoskin was present. He sat through the presentation without speaking. His face was controlled and polished and told her nothing. She held Vladislav's gaze instead and thought about the fire in October, and the archive in December, and the street in January, and the specific texture of a love that had been built from legal documents and honest questions, and the willingness to walk toward difficulty rather than away from it. When the formal presentation concluded, the chair of the council said, in a dry and ancient voice, that she had lived through many things in 800 years of court life, and that she found this particular development considerably more interesting than most of what had happened in the last century. Adeline thanked her. In May, Vladislav took her to see the original site of House Belisar's founding, a valley in the Carpathian Mountains so remote that the road to it was more memory than infrastructure, and in a certain light the ruins of the original house were visible beneath the overgrowth of 500 years. He showed her where the great hall had been, where he had sat to write the blood covenant by candlelight over a series of nights in 1423, how the fireplace had been oriented because he had believed at the time that there was something important about being able to see the direction of dawn, even if you could not step into it. She stood in the remains of that fireplace space and looked at him and felt the full weight of what it meant to love someone who had lived long enough to have ruins, to carry the physical memory of things that no longer existed anywhere except in his recollection. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "To come back here?" He stood beside her in the mountain light, which was the particular blue-gold of late afternoon. "It did," he said, "for a long time. Now it is different." "Different how?" He looked at her. "It is a beginning," he said, "not an ending." She understood what he meant. She reached for his hand. They stood there together in the old stones and the light until the sun began to lower properly, and he needed to step back into the shade of the tree line. And then she went with him into the trees, where the light was filtered and cool, and he told her about the night he had written Article 12, why he had included it, what he had believed about the relationship between vampire law and human life, that had made him put it into the formal covenant when others had argued against it. "I believed that any system of law that treated human life as less than sovereign was a system that would eventually collapse under the weight of its own injustice," he said. "I have seen it happen, many times, over many centuries. The houses that built themselves on human exploitation did not endure." "And House Belisar endured," she said. "House Belisar endured," he confirmed. "Because of the decree," she said. He looked at her with those silver eyes, warm in the mountain shade. "Partly," he said, "and partly because of other things, more recent things." She moved closer to him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him in the shadow of the old forest and thought about 600 years of law, and the very specific sentence she had read in October that had changed the direction of her life, and found that she was not sorry about any of it. In June, the Pure Line made one final attempt. They brought a challenge to the High Charter directly, bypassing the Vienna Council entirely, arguing that the formal court acknowledgement of a human companion to a vampire house lord constituted a violation of the Charter's original sovereignty provisions. It was a reach. It was also the kind of reach that, if allowed to proceed unchallenged, could do damage. Vladislav and Adeline went to the High Charter sitting together. Adeline presented the historical evidence. There were 3 precedents from before 1600 that showed human companions formally acknowledged in house records, meaning the practice was as old as the Charter itself and had never been formally prohibited. She had found all 3, verified all 3, and organized them in a presentation that the High Charter adjudicators, who were not young and not easily impressed, listened to with a quality of attention that told her she had their full engagement. Vladislav presented the political argument. He was measured and precise and entirely without concession. He reminded the Charter of House Belisar's unbroken record since 1423. He reminded them of the blood covenant, his own covenant, and what it had established. He reminded them, with quiet and devastating effect, of what vampire courts looked like in historical periods when human-vampire relations had been governed by fear and suppression rather than law. The High Charter dismissed the Pure Line's challenge unanimously. When they walked out of that chamber into the June afternoon, the sunlight was bright and strong, and Vladislav stopped just inside the arched doorway, where the shadow still reached, and Adeline stood 1 step ahead of him in the full light, and she turned back and looked at him in the shadow and in the light and said, "Come to Prague with me." He raised an eyebrow. "Tesavo invited us," she said. "Properly, in a letter, with a date and a menu. His letter arrived last week. I told him we would come when we had resolved the Charter matter." "You were planning this during the Charter sitting?" he said. "I was planning this during the Charter sitting," she confirmed. "It helped. I knew what we were walking toward when we finished." He looked at her with the full weight of 600 years behind his eyes, and the very specific warmth of this particular year in the foreground of them. "Prague," he said. "Prague," she said. "Tesavo's house. Dinner. You two can argue about the 15th century, and I will take notes." "You will participate," he said. "You will not take notes. You will argue, and you will be right about half the things and wrong about none of the important ones." "That is a generous assessment," she said. "It is an accurate one," he said. They went to Prague in July. Tesavo's house was old and full of books and smelled of old paper, and something herbal and thyme. Tesavo himself was a small, sharp-featured vampire of extraordinary age, who looked at Adeline the moment she walked through the door and said, "Yes, I understand completely," which she interpreted as a compliment, and which Vladislav confirmed was the highest possible form of Tesavo's approval. They spent 3 days in Prague. They argued about the 15th century. Adeline was right about most things, and Tesavo revised 2 of his published opinions based on her evidence, which he did cheerfully and without defensiveness, writing corrections into the margins of his own books in real time. Vladislav watched this with the expression he got when something pleased him deeply, a contained satisfaction that showed itself mostly in the set of his mouth and the quality of his attention. On the last evening, Tesavo produced a bottle of something so old it had no label and poured 3 glasses, one of something red that he gave to Vladislav and Adeline noticed she was not going to ask about, and one of a clear amber liquid that he placed in front of her, which turned out to be a honey-based spirit from the 17th century that was the finest thing she had ever tasted. "To Article 12, Tesavo said, raising his glass. They all raised their glasses. "To the woman who remembered it," Vladislav said, looking at Adeline. She looked back at him. The candlelight of Tesavo's dining room was golden, and the summer dark was gentle outside the old windows, and Vladislav was watching her across the table with an expression that was not managed or contained or careful. It was simply the full thing, present and clear, and as ancient and as specific and as real as any document she had ever held. "To the man who wrote it," she said. They stayed in Prague 1 extra day because neither of them was in a hurry to leave, and Tesavo made it extremely clear that the extra day was not only acceptable but required. On that extra day they walked along the Vltava in the evening and talked about nothing particularly important, and everything that was, and stopped on a bridge in the amber light, and stood with the river moving below them. I want to show you more, Vladislav said. The other places. There are houses, archives, places where things happened that you would find significant. I have been to all of them, and I would like to go to them again with you. Is this a proposal? She asked. He smiled, fully. The kind of smile that had taken months to arrive and was now she had found, something she encountered regularly and never stopped finding remarkable. It is an invitation, he said. The proposal comes later, with considerably more ceremony, because I am 600 years old and I believe in doing things properly. She laughed. He listened to her laugh the same way she listened to his, with the specific attention of someone cataloguing a favorite thing. Then I accept the invitation, she said, and I will hold you to the ceremony. I would expect nothing less, he said. He kept the promise of ceremony with absolute thoroughness. In October, exactly 1 year after the night she had stood in a vampire council chamber and quoted his decree back to him. The location was the residence, which had become by increments their shared space, without anyone formally declaring it so. The occasion was a formal house dinner, small and specific, attended by Tessivo and Solvane and 2 members of Vladislav's houseguard who had, over the year, developed a careful and genuine respect for Adeline. The ceremony involved the formal documents of House Belisar's oldest tradition and a ring with a stone the color of his eyes. He asked her in the old Wallachian first. Formally and completely, with all the legal precision she had come to understand, was not a substitute for emotion, but an expression of it, the way he made everything that mattered into something lasting and recorded and real. Then he asked her again in German simply. She said yes to both. Tessivo produced champagne from somewhere and made a toast that went on for 7 minutes and referenced 3 historical precedents and 2 personal anecdotes, and ended with something in the oldest Wallachian that made Vladislav's expression do the warm contained thing, and Adeline resolved to ask for a translation later. The translation, when she received it, was, "She is the best argument you ever made, and you have made many good ones." Later, when the guests had gone and the residence was quiet, and the fire was doing its usual small work in the fireplace, Adeline sat with the ring on her hand and her head against Vladislav's shoulder, and the full settled weight of a year that had started in a council chamber and arrived here. 1 year ago, he said. 1 year ago, she said. You were convinced you were forgotten. I was, he said, thoroughly convinced. And then I quoted your decree, she said. He pressed his lips to her hair. And then you quoted my decree, he said, and a great many things changed. She thought about all the things that had changed. The blood list and the archive and the January street and the Carpathian Valley and Prague and every evening in between. All the ordinary evenings that were only ordinary because the extraordinary had become the shape of their daily life. The law and the history and the fire and the books and the specific texture of learning someone completely. I had no idea, she said, when I read that document in October, what I was walking into. No, he said. Neither did I. Are you glad, she asked, not anxiously. Simply curious, the way she asked everything. He was quiet for a moment, not the managed quiet, not the careful quiet. Just the genuine thing, the quality of someone finding the precise words for something important. I spent 60 years convincing myself that withdrawal was a kind of wisdom, he said. That the world had moved past what I had built, that the things I had believed in and written into law were curiosities now, historical footnotes. I told myself I had given what I had to give, and that the rest was simply living out the centuries. He paused. And then someone sat down in a council chamber and read my words and meant them, every word, with the complete conviction of someone who actually believes that a law written 600 years ago matters because it is true, not because it is old. He lifted her hand and looked at the ring. I was not forgotten. I was waiting. I simply did not know I was waiting until you showed me what I was waiting for. She did not say anything for a while. She thought about that, about the specific miracle of a person finding that the thing they thought was gone was simply dormant, waiting for the right catalyst, and that sometimes the catalyst was a 34-year-old professor of medieval history who took her job very seriously and had excellent research skills and could not stay quiet when silence would have cost a life. For what it is worth, she said, I was also waiting. I had work I loved and a life I had built carefully, and I was not unhappy. But I was alone in a particular way that I had started to believe was simply the condition. that there was no one who would understand what I meant by the things I cared about. Who would find the same things important? And then, he said, and then I found a decree from 1423 that was so carefully, specifically just, she said. And I thought whoever wrote this was someone who understood. And then I found out who wrote it, and he was right there in the room. He made a sound that was very quiet and very warm. We found each other through a document, she said. We found each other through principle, he said. The document was incidental. She smiled against his shoulder. Outside, Vienna moved in its nighttime self, beautiful and old and full of things happening at multiple depths. The visible city and the hidden one, the trams and the opera houses, and beneath them the chambers where ancient beings debated blood law by candlelight. She was part of both now. She always had been, she thought. She had just needed the right door. Vladislav, she said. Yes, thank you, she said, for writing Article 12. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, thank you for reading it. The fire made its small sounds. The ring caught the light. The year had come all the way around and deposited them here, in this warmth, in this specific and hard-won certainty that they had built together from law and honesty, and the refusal to stay quiet when staying quiet would have cost something real. Some loves arrive with fanfare and declaration, and the immediate certainty of their own significance. Some loves build themselves quietly over months of arguments about wrong books and late evenings in archives, and walks home through November streets, until one day you look up from the work and realize that the thing you thought was background has been the whole story all along. Adeline Rosenfeld had spent her career believing that the past was alive, in ways most people fail to appreciate, that old words had force and old laws had teeth, and that something written down in genuine belief did not simply lose its truth because centuries had passed over it. She had been right about all of it. Vladislav Belisar had spent 60 years believing that what he had built was finished, and that the world had moved on without him, and he had sat in his withdrawal like a man who had read the last page of his own story, and was simply waiting for the book to close. He had been wrong about all of it. The truth was what it had always been. A decree written with genuine conviction about the value of human life, a woman who found it and read it and stood up in a room full of ancient and dangerous beings and said, this matters, this is true, and this will be honored. A man who heard his own words quoted back to him across 6 centuries and understood in that moment that the book had not ended, that it had been waiting all along for the next chapter to begin, and it had, and it was extraordinary, and it was theirs.